To begin, I want to say clearly that we should care about it simply because that catastrophe has become a threat to the United States and to the region. What do I mean by that? The first is that the regime in control, by Nicolás Maduro, is a state sponsor of drug trafficking. It's very simple. What I mean by that is this: drug trafficking networks enjoy the protection of the Venezuelan government. In fact, one of the concessions, literally one of the contracts that the Maduro regime gives its cronies and loyalists is drug trafficking networks. So a drug trafficker who wants to move coca through Colombia into Venezuela and then into the Caribbean or Europe will find the right general or the right individual in the Maduro government, and that individual will ensure that their plane is not shot down, and that, in fact, the military and the government organisms of the government of Venezuela, the government of Maduro, protects them, facilitates them. The people who are supposed to be stopping them are helping them. It's a racket. It resembles organized crime. That is what Maduro does. And as we have seen, an incredible surge in coca production in Colombia to historic levels of the last couple of years, it is headed here to a nation that is already struggling with an opioid crisis. We are about to be flooded with cheap cocaine once again, and a significant amount of it will be trafficked into this country with the aid and the assistance and the support of the dictator in Venezuela. That is a threat to the United States and to the region. Number two, he is a threat to the United States and to the region because he has triggered a migratory crisis that is destabilizing all of Venezuela's neighbors, primarily Colombia, which each day is absorbing tens of thousands of people fleeing starvation and rampant disease, unlike anything we have ever seen absent a natural disaster in this hemisphere. And it is destabilizing countries that are already struggling. Colombia is already struggling to try to deal with drug trafficking groups that are, in many parts of that country, more powerful than the government in some areas, and the demobilization of the FARC and another terrorist group called the ELN. And on top of that, they are now we've invested, along with our Colombian partners, millions and millions of American taxpayer money to help Colombia, that just a decade and a half ago was on the verge of being a failed state, to help them to succeed. And they are among our best allies in the world, and certainly, if not our best, one of the best, top of the list allies in the Western Hemisphere. They're being destabilized because they are absorbing tens of thousands of migrants a day who are fleeing not just political oppression, but starvation. Starvation. Healthcare experts are telling us that children in Venezuela today will not fully develop physically to their full potential because they are malnourished today. Infants, newborns, dying in cribs and in hospitals because of a lack of medicine, because of a lack of food. These are images that we are used to seeing in other parts of the world, and it breaks our heart when it happens somewhere else. This is happening in our hemisphere, and it is all man-made in one of the richest countries in the hemisphere, the most oil-rich country on the planet. Just a few years ago, one of the most prosperous economies in the entire region. People are starving, and they are starving because of a man-made crisis, because the Maduro regime uses food as a weapon. Number one of the other concessions it gives the cronies around Maduro is, if you are a loyalist, he puts you in charge of food distribution. And what does that mean? That means you can cipher the limited food into the black market where you can make an exorbitant profit. Obviously, you're going to take some for yourself, so your family gets to eat. And then they have the sick process, where in order for you to get food from the government, you have to show up with your ID, your government-issued ID in Venezuela. And they know who the government supporters are, and they know who isn't. They know who turns out to vote, and they know who doesn't. In a fraudulent election, by the way, because ultimately they will manipulate it, as they've done before. And so imagine, they know that you didn't vote for them. They know how you voted, because they monitor the machines. And if you support the government, you get food. And if you don't get food. That's why he doesn't want food coming in. The third is we are engaged in this, what I believe is global competition or battle between authoritarianism and democracy. The rise and the threat of growing authoritarianism in Turkey and the Philippines, obviously China and Russia. And in this hemisphere, it's Venezuela. And Venezuela is openly attacking the regional democratic order. Openly. They basically canceled their constitution, They've tried to replace the democratically elected National Assembly. They removed the legitimate judiciary branch and replaced it with loyalists of their own. And fourth, there is growing body of evidence that the Maduro regime provides a platform for the enemies of the security of the United States. That includes Russia and Hezbollah. The spillover effects are undermining our efforts and the efforts of our regional partners to promote democracy and human rights and stability in our own backyard, in our hemisphere. That was apparent last week at the summit, where a growing number of countries, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, are making incredible strides and continue to build upon the democratic structures they have in place. The Peruvian president recently had to resign after a previous president resigned because rule of law is working. In Brazil, the same thing. They're going to have elections this year in Mexico, in Brazil, in Colombia. These will be legitimate elections. And they may elect someone that agrees with us 50% of the time, and they may elect someone that agrees with us 90% of the time, but they will elect someone. And yet, in stark contrast to that, is basically the coup d'etat that's occurred in Venezuela, where a small group of people have canceled the democratic order, or at least tried to. In all of this, there's great news embedded, and that is that for the first time in recent memory, the democracies of the region have come together to act on it. It began with the so-called Lima Group, which is a collection of countries that collectively make up the overwhelming majority of the economic power and the population size of the hemisphere. And they have long banded together to criticize the democratic order. We're not even officially a member of it, but they have been supportive of the moves made by this administration to target Maduro. Well, last week at the summit, all the members of the Lima Group, plus two, the Bahamas and the government of the United States, issued a joint statement rejecting the sham presidential vote on May 20th in favor of free elections and strongly urging the Venezuelan dictatorship to release all political prisoners. The problem is, as I met with members of civil society and the illegitimate elected representatives in the National Assembly of Venezuela, is we have reached an inflection point now. Statements, letters, communiques are fine, but the time to act is now. Because people are dying, they're starving to death. The humanitarian crisis alone compels us to take action. So the question people pose to me is, well, what can we do? And some of the traditional ideas that people roll out there, additional sanctions, sure. But there's more that can be done, and I want to quickly highlight what I hope will be the three things that happen. The first is let's decide first on a forum. The ideal forum to deal with this is an organization, a multilateral organization created specifically for the purpose of defending democracy in the Western Hemisphere. That's called the Organization of American States. It is a group of 34 nations. It was designed to deal exactly with this. Sadly, a small, and I mean a very small minority of some of the smallest countries in the OAS, particularly in the Caribbean, who frankly have been bribed and or compromised from voting against the Maduro regime because either they continue to receive cheap oil at dwindling amounts, or their leaders in this government or the previous one basically stole the money and the oil, and now the Venezuelans know it, and they're going to release it publicly if these guys break from them. A small number of these countries, representing less than 10 or 15%, maybe even less than 10% of the population of the region, have banded together to prevent the OAS from expelling Venezuela, a dictatorship, from the OAS, an organization of democracies. I don't think we should give up on the OAS. We should continue to try at the OAS to be the forum for the plan I'm about to outline, but if that doesn't work, then there has to be an alternative. And the alternative, I believe, should be the Lima Group plus at least one, the United States. And what I hope will happen is that the Lima Group will meet before or shortly after the May election, that it will be a meeting of Treasury ministers, foreign ministers, or both, which is why we need a Secretary of State to be there, to chart a regional approach on a way forward to Venezuela. And here's what I believe that regional approach should be. Number one is collectively we must announce that we are going to continue to increase in a multilateral way the pressure on the Maduro regime. And the way we should do that is by coordinating these national-level sanctions that target Maduro regime criminal elements. Target these drug traffickers. Target the people that are trafficking in the food and controlling the food distribution for their own purposes. Target their shell companies that they are using to make money and store their money and hide their money. If all of these nations did that, encompassing the U.S. financial sector, the Brazilian, the Colombian, the Panamanian banking sector, which would be critical in this, It would provide increasing pressure on that regime and on Maduro's loyalists to break. The goal is to maximize the pain felt by these corrupt, oppressive, and illegitimate government officials. The second thing we need to do is we must address the humanitarian crisis that is spiraling out of control. As I said already, 3 to 4 million Venezuelans have fled their country to escape starvation, deprivation, violence. Neighboring states are bearing the disproportionate burdens, and they need help in doing so. And I think we need to continue to provide that assistance. But ultimately, the answer to Venezuela's future is not outside of Venezuela, it is inside of it. And that is why it is my hope that the priority of this new group, the Lima Group plus at least one, the United States, would be to open up a humanitarian corridor that allows food and medicine to go inside of Venezuela. And it can be distributed by a non-governmental organization. Put the Catholic Church in charge, or the Red Cross. Can't be the Maduro government. They will steal it. In fact, they won't even allow it. The Maduro regime will not allow humanitarian aid to come in, because for them, one, they would lose the leverage of using food and medicine against their people, and two, it would have to acknowledge they have a crisis. We must do all we can to force that humanitarian avenue to open, that we can deliver food and medicine to the people who are dying and starving and dying of simple diseases for lack of basic medicine. It's critical that the people of Venezuela know that food and medicine and international aid is ready to be delivered into their country. Putting up the pictures of the trucks and the warehouses, all of this food and all of this medicine is ready to come in. And the only thing standing in the way is the corrupt, evil government that today has empowered itself of your nation. And the third thing that we need to be doing as part of this plan is preparing to help rebuild the free and democratic Venezuela after Maduro leaves power. And the third thing that I hope that this gathering will reach is a consensus and an agreement that we will set up the equivalent of a Venezuelan Marshall Plan that includes investment from the Inter-American Development Bank, significant contributions from the United States and our partners to help go in and rebuild the disaster and the catastrophe that the Maduro regime will leave behind. We also need to help empower the legitimate institutions. When we talk about the Venezuelan opposition, what we need to understand is these are not rebels in a mountain. These are the National Assembly elected by their people. It would be as if a parallel Senate was created and we were no longer paid salaries or staff, often no longer allowed to meet, and our laws were no longer given the force of law. That's what's happened. But the National Assembly is there. We need to support them. We need to make clear that they are the legitimate representatives of the Venezuelan people, the only leaders in government today, along with some of the governors who were legitimately elected under the Venezuelan Constitution. They're having a problem, by the way. When they show up at our embassy in Venezuela, they are being denied visas to travel abroad. At a minimum, we should be granting them visas to travel abroad, recognizing them as fellow parliamentarians who have a right to speak on behalf of the people of Venezuela. And the other thing that we need to do is cooperate with a real equivalent of a Supreme Court, many of them who are now in exile but who continue to meet. That is their credible and legitimate judicial system. We should be cooperating with them and helping them. They have all sorts of information about corruption that implicates Venezuelan activities in the United States. I'll close with this. The dictatorship in Venezuela knows, and the people that surround Nicolás Maduro know that they are on borrowed time. It is our obligation to expedite that, not through a military intervention, not through just simple unilateral sanctions, which I support and we're prepared to continue to do, but ideally through an international, multinational, regional effort in which the United States is a partner with our allies in the region to continue to pressure the regime with sanctions, to deliver humanitarian aid inside and outside of Venezuela, and to create the mechanisms to rebuild that country's institutions and its economy. This is an opportunity for regional leadership. In a time where democracy and authoritarianism are in conflict all over the world, this is an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow to authoritarianism in our hemisphere. And it cannot happen with America alone, but it cannot happen without American leadership. This is the plan I hope we'll pursue. This is the method I hope we will use. But to do it, we need a strong leader at the Department of State to be a catalyst for all of this. And it is why I urge my colleagues to rally and support doing something about Venezuela. And one of the best ways you can do that right now is to confirm Mike Pompeo as the next Secretary of State. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.